The man grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back, right there on the dance floor, in front of 200 people. She did not scream. She just went still, the way a person goes still when they have learned that screaming only makes it worse. Nobody moved. A room full of guests in their good clothes, and not one of them stepped forward. Her sister froze at the cake table with a knife in her hand. The groom looked at his shoes. And the woman being hurt, a quiet woman named Maggie who had spent 6 years disappearing a little more every day, reached into the small purse on her hip and pulled out a phone. She dialed one number. 3 words. "Can you come get me?" Now who did she just call, and why did that man never see it coming? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a little, because you need to understand who this woman was before she learned to go quiet. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, but everybody who loved her called her Maggie, and there was a time when a whole lot of people loved her out loud. She grew up in a 2-story house at the end of a gravel road just outside a town called Redfield, and the driveway of that house was almost never empty. There were motorcycles parked 3 deep most weekends. Big ones. Loud ones. Men with beards and leather vests who called her father by a name that was not on his birth certificate. Because Maggie's daddy was a man named Duke Sullivan, and Duke was not a man you forgot. Duke was the president of the local charter. That is the polite way to say it. The louder way to say it is that Duke Sullivan was the boss, and when Duke walked into a bar, the noise level dropped by half and the price of everybody's drink somehow got cheaper. He was 6'3" with hands like catcher's mitts, and he had a laugh you could hear across a parking lot. He was also, and I want you to hear this part, the gentlest father a girl ever had. He braided Maggie's hair before school. Badly. He showed up to every recital in that vest, and sat in the front row and cried when she played the piano. The other men cried too, because if Duke cried, everybody cried. That was the rule. Let me tell you one story about Duke, because one story will tell you more than 10 pages of me describing him. When Maggie was 9 years old, some older boys at the county fair knocked her off her bike and took the $2 her daddy had given her for cotton candy, and they laughed while they did it. Maggie walked all the way home with a skinned knee and told her father, and everybody expected Duke to go find those boys or their fathers and do something loud about it. He didn't. Instead, he sat her down on the porch steps and cleaned her knee himself, slow and careful, and he said, "Maggie, I want you to remember something. There's 2 kinds of strong in this world. There's the kind that takes from folks who can't stop him, and there's the kind that stands between the taking and the folks who can't stop it. The first kind ain't strong at all. It's just a coward with the advantage. You stay away from that kind your whole life, you hear me? And if you can't stay away from him, you call me." 9 years old. She never forgot it. You are going to want to remember it too, because it comes back around before we're done. So Maggie grew up protected. Not spoiled. Protected. She grew up knowing that if anybody ever laid a hand on her, there were 40 men who would appear out of nowhere and make that a problem for the rest of that person's life. She never had to think about it. It was just the air she breathed. A safety. The kind of safety most people only read about. And there was one man in particular. Duke's oldest friend, his right hand, a mountain of a human being everybody called Bear. Real name Cole Mercer, but nobody used it. Bear had been at the hospital the night Maggie was born, and he had held her when she was 1 hour old, and this enormous, terrifying man had looked down at that little pink face and gone completely to pieces. Bear was her godfather. Bear taught her to ride a bicycle and later, quietly, without her mother knowing, taught her to ride a motorcycle in an empty field when she was 15. He was patient in a way big men are not supposed to be. He'd let her stall that bike 40 times in a row and never once raise his voice, just say, "Again. You got it. Again." Bear was the second most important man in her life, and when Duke died, he became the first, whether either of them said it out loud or not. Because Duke did die. Cancer. Not a gunfight, not a crash, just a bad diagnosis and 8 cruel months. And at the end, that big laughing man weighed 130 pounds and could not lift his own coffee cup. Maggie was 22. She sat with him every single night. And I want you to picture Bear during those 8 months, because it matters later. Bear parked himself in the hallway outside that hospital room like a dog that won't leave a grave, and he did not go home, and the nurses stopped trying to make him. He ran errands. He brought Duke's favorite soup that Duke could no longer eat. He sat there and read the man the sports page in a low rumble when Duke was too weak to hold the paper. And the last real thing Duke Sullivan ever said, when the medicine had him halfway gone, he said it to both of them, to his daughter on one side of the bed and to his oldest friend on the other. He looked at Maggie and he said, "You ever need anything, you call the club. You are one of us. You will always be one of us. Don't you forget it." And then he turned his head and he looked at Bear and he said, "You hear that? She's yours now. You watch her." And Bear, who had never in his life been unable to speak, could not answer. He just took Duke's hand, that hand that used to be like a catcher's mitt and was now just bones in a paper glove, and he nodded. That was the promise. Remember it. The whole story hangs on it. But grief does strange things to people. After Duke was buried, that whole world got too loud for Maggie. Every motorcycle she heard sounded like her father coming home, and then it wasn't him, and it broke her heart 40 times a day. So she pulled back. She moved 2 towns over. She got a little apartment and a job at a dental office answering phones, and she started building a quiet, ordinary life, the kind of life where nobody wears a vest and nobody dies young. She told herself it was healing. Maybe part of it was. Bear called every couple weeks at first, and she'd let it ring, and then she'd feel guilty, and then she'd call back and they'd talk about nothing, and then the calls got further apart and she let them. Not because she stopped loving him. Because every time she heard his voice, she heard her father's hospital room, and she could not stand inside that grief and build a new life at the same time. So she chose the new life. She'd tell you now that was the first door she closed on herself. There were going to be a lot more. And that is exactly when Dale Prentice walked in for a cleaning and a set of x-rays, and decided that Maggie Sullivan was going to be his. Now I have to be fair to the man for one paragraph, because that is how these things work. At the start, Dale was charming. He owned the biggest car dealership in 3 counties, Prentice Auto. You could not drive down the highway without seeing his face grinning off a billboard. He wore good suits. He opened doors. He sent flowers to the whole office, so it wouldn't look like he was only after her. And everybody at that dental office told Maggie she'd hit the jackpot. He was successful. He was respectable. He was everything the leather and motorcycle world was not. And to a girl who had just watched that world take her daddy, respectable sounded a lot like safe. She married him in 11 months. Bear was not invited to the wedding, and to this day Maggie is ashamed of that, because she told herself the two worlds didn't need to mix. She told herself Dale wouldn't understand. She had no idea yet how much Dale would never, ever understand. But I want to slow down here, because this is the part everybody watching gets wrong, and I don't want you to get it wrong. People always ask, why did she marry him? Couldn't she see it? No. She could not see it, and neither could you, because at the start there was nothing to see. Dale did not walk in swinging. Dale walked in with flowers. The trap a man like that builds does not look like a trap. It looks like being chosen. It looks like a handsome, successful man deciding out of the whole world that you, specifically you, are the one he wants, and paying attention to you in a way that feels, at first, like the sun coming out. That is how it works. The cage is built one warm day at a time, and by the time the door shuts, you've already forgotten there was ever an outside. The change came slow, the way it always does. First, it was little corrections. Don't wear that dress, it makes you look cheap. Don't laugh so loud, people are staring. And here is the sick genius of it. He never said it mean at the start. He said it like he was helping her. Like he was the only one who cared enough to tell her the truth about herself. I'm just looking out for you, Mags. Nobody else is going to tell you. And she started to believe that only Dale saw her clearly, and everyone else was just being polite. Then it was money. Dale controlled all of it, gave her an allowance, made her show receipts. He set it up so her paycheck from the dental office went into an account she couldn't touch. For the future, he said, for us. And every dollar she spent she had to account for like a child bringing home a report card. She once bought a $12 paperback book at the drugstore and forgot to save the receipt. And Dale made her sit at the kitchen table for 2 hours explaining where $12 had gone, until she was crying and apologizing for a book. She stopped buying books. Then it was people. He didn't like her friends. There was a woman named Carol from the dental office, Maggie's best friend for years, funny and sharp, and the only person Maggie really laughed with anymore. Dale decided Carol was jealous and a bad influence, and always putting ideas in your head. Every time Maggie came home from seeing Carol, there was a fight, a long, cold, ugly one, and it was never worth it. And so one day Maggie just stopped answering Carol's texts. She didn't decide to end the friendship. She just let the fight not be worth it so many times that the friendship starved to death. Carol sent one last message that said, "I don't know what I did, but I miss you." And Maggie deleted it so Dale wouldn't see and cried in the work bathroom, and that was that. One by one, they all fell away like that, because it was always easier than the fight that came after. Then it was her family. He said her mother was pushy. He said her sister Katie was a bad influence, same words he'd used on Carol, and by then Maggie was so worn down she almost believed him. Slowly the phone calls got shorter and the visits got rarer, and Maggie's whole big, warm, loud world shrank down to the inside of a very nice house, where a very respected man told her every day, in 100 small ways, that she was nothing without him. That was always the message underneath all of it. Not "I love you." The message was, "You are lucky I put up with you. Nobody else would. Without me, you are nothing." And when you hear that every day for years, in a house with no windows to any other opinion, you start to think it might be true. Katie was the only one who wouldn't fully let go, and I need you to remember Katie, because Katie is a bigger part of this than she looks. Where their mother gave up and got hurt and backed off, Katie kept knocking. She'd call the house phone knowing Dale might answer. She'd drive over uninvited with a pie and sit in the kitchen making small talk, while Dale watched them both from the doorway. And every single time when she got Maggie alone for even 10 seconds, Katie would grab her hands and look her dead in the eye and say, "Are you okay? You can tell me. Whatever it is, you can tell me." And every single time Maggie would smile and say, "I'm fine, Katie, you worry too much." Because that is the other thing the cage does. It teaches you to protect the person hurting you. It teaches you that telling the truth is the dangerous thing, not the bruise. Katie knew. In her gut, Katie knew for years. She just couldn't get Maggie to say the word out loud, and you cannot save somebody who won't say the word. It ate at Katie. She'll tell you now it was the worst helplessness she ever felt, watching her big sister disappear in slow motion behind a smile, one visit at a time, and never being able to grab hold of anything solid enough to pull her out. And then about 3 years in, the first time he hit her, he cried afterward. Got down on his knees. Swore it would never happen again. He brought her jewelry the next day, a bracelet that cost more than her car, and he was tender and broken and sorry, so sorry, and she believed him, because she wanted to. Because the alternative, that she had married a man who would hit her and mean it, was a truth too big to carry. So she took the smaller truth. It was a one-time thing. He was under stress. It was partly her fault, she'd pushed him. She wore that bracelet and she told herself a story, and the story was a warm blanket. And under the warm blanket she went to sleep, and the cage door clicked one notch tighter. The second time he did not cry. There was no bracelet the second time. The second time he told her she'd made him do it. By the 6th year, he did not even apologize. He just expected her to fix her own face with makeup before they went out, and she got very, very good at it. She kept a specific concealer in her purse, a heavier one, and she knew exactly how to blend along the cheekbone, how to angle her face in photographs, how to say, "I walked into the cabinet," so smooth and easy that she half believed it herself. She wore long sleeves in July. She wore sunglasses on cloudy days. She became an artist, and her art was making sure nobody ever saw. That is the woman standing at that wedding. A woman who could cover a bruise in 4 minutes flat and smile while she did it. A woman who had learned to go still. I want to say one more thing about the going still, because it's the saddest true thing in this whole story, and you need to understand it or you'll judge her wrong. The stillness is not weakness. The stillness is a skill. It is a thing a body learns because it works. She learned that if she fought, it got worse. If she cried, it got worse. If she explained, it got worse. But if she went still, if she went absolutely quiet and small and gave him nothing to push against, sometimes, it ended faster. So her body learned it, the way your hand learns to pull back from a stove. It was the only power she had left, the power to feel nothing and show nothing and wait for it to be over. She was very good at it by year 6. She had had a lot of practice. What Dale did not know, what nobody at that dental office ever knew, what Dale would have laughed at if you told him, was whose daughter he had married. He thought Maggie came from nothing. She let him think it. She had buried that whole life so deep, out of grief at first, and then out of a kind of shame Dale had taught her, that even the mention of a motorcycle made her flinch and change the subject. Dale liked that she had no family to speak of. He said it like a selling point. It made her easier to own. And that, my friends, was the one mistake that was going to cost Dale Prentice everything. The wedding that day was for Katie. Little sister Katie, all grown up, marrying a good soft-spoken schoolteacher named Sam, and the whole thing was happening at a rented hall out on County Road 9, one of those places with a gravel lot and string lights, and a rented dance floor laid down over the concrete. Maggie had almost not been allowed to come. And I do mean almost, because the fight over it started a full week before. See, when the invitation came, Dale threw it in the trash. Just like that, in front of her, dropped it in the kitchen garbage on top of the coffee grounds. Said they weren't going. Said he wasn't going to waste a Saturday watching Maggie's white trash sister marry some broke teacher. And Maggie, who almost never pushed. She fished that invitation out of the trash when he was at work, and she pressed it flat and she hid it. And every day that week, she found a small, quiet way to bring it up, to plead, to promise. She offered to work extra. She offered to skip her own birthday. She debased herself for the right to go watch her only sister get married. And if that doesn't tell you exactly how far down the hole she was, nothing will. And on the morning of the wedding, Dale finally agreed, and he made her stand in their walk-in closet while he laid out the terms like a contract. She could go. On one condition: that she remember whose wife she was and not embarrass him. That she keep her mouth shut about the biker stuff nobody wanted to hear. And that they left when he said they left. She promised. She always promised. They arrived late because Dale wanted to arrive late. He liked to make an entrance, and he liked to make Maggie stand next to him while he shook hands and told everybody about the new boat. Maggie found her sister in the bridal room, and the two of them held each other and cried for a second. And I want you to see this moment because it's the last quiet one they get. Katie, in her white dress, pulled back and held Maggie's face in both hands and looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd been trying to for 6 years, and she whispered, "Are you okay?" the way she always did now with that scared look. And Maggie said, "I'm fine, don't be silly, go get married." And Katie held that look 1 second longer, like she was about to say something bigger, and then she let it go, because it was her wedding day and what was she going to do? And she went and got married, and it was beautiful, the ceremony out under the trees, the schoolteacher's voice shaking on his vows, and for about 45 minutes Maggie forgot to be afraid. 45 minutes. That was the whole vacation she got. That was the setup. Now here is where the day started turning. The reception got going, and so did Dale, because Dale was a drinker. Not a fun drinker. A mean one. And here's a detail that matters, because Katie had thought of it. Katie had begged the man running the bar to keep an eye on her brother-in-law and go light on him. And the bartender tried. He really did. But Dale was the kind of man who found the loophole in everything. He got a flask out of the glove box. He had a guy at the bar buy him doubles. 2 bourbons in, and the smiling stopped and the watching started. He watched Maggie the whole time, tracking her around the room like she was inventory that might walk off the lot. When she laughed with an old cousin, his jaw tightened. When she danced one slow song with her new brother-in-law Sam, a completely innocent thing, a family thing, a thing Sam had shyly asked permission for, Dale set his glass down hard enough that people at the next table looked over. Katie saw it too. Katie spent her own wedding reception with one eye on her sister and her stomach in a knot, and later she'd say she knew all night, that something was going to happen, and she hated herself for hoping it would hold off just until after the cake. And then Maggie made a mistake. A tiny one. She was standing at the bar getting her mother a glass of wine, and an old man came up beside her, a wiry old fellow in a cheap sport coat, and he said, "You're Duke's girl, aren't you?" "Little Maggie." "My lord, you look just like your daddy." And Maggie's whole face lit up, the first real light in it all night, and she said, "You knew my father." And the old man said he sure did, rode with him 30 years. And for 2 minutes Maggie stood there glowing, talking about a man she loved in a world she'd left behind. He told her a story, quick, about the time Duke rode 200 miles in the rain to sit in a stranger's hospital waiting room, because one of the young guys had a baby coming and nobody else could get away. "That was your daddy," he said. "That's who he was. He showed up." And Maggie's eyes filled, because she hadn't heard her father's name out loud from someone who loved him in 6 years, and she didn't realize until that exact second how starved she'd been for it. Dale appeared like a bad smell. He put his hand on the back of Maggie's neck, not gentle, and he said to the old man loud, "She's married. To me. You can move along, pal." And the old man looked at Dale, and then he looked at Dale's hand on the back of Maggie's neck, and then he looked at Maggie's face, and something crossed his features, something old and knowing and sad. He'd seen that hand before. He'd seen it his whole life on other men, and he knew exactly what it meant, and he knew in 1 second the whole shape of the thing. He just nodded slow and stepped away. But he didn't leave the reception. Remember that. He stepped away and he found a shadow by the propane tanks at the edge of the lot, and he took out his own phone and he made a call, and then he watched. Keep him in your mind. His name is coming. Dale walked Maggie back to their table by the neck, sat her down, leaned in close, so his mouth was at her ear and it looked, to anybody watching, almost tender. And he said, "You want to make a fool of me at this hillbilly circus in front of these people. You want to talk about your dead criminal daddy in front of my clients. We're leaving after the cake. And when we get home, you and me are gonna have a conversation." Maggie knew what that word meant. Conversation. She'd worn long sleeves in July because of that word. She felt the old stillness come down over her like a curtain, the way it always did, her body getting ahead of her mind, going quiet, going small, preparing. She folded her hands in her lap and she looked at the table. But something was different this time, and even she couldn't have told you what it was yet. Maybe it was the old man. Maybe it was hearing her father's name. Maybe it was watching her baby sister get married and thinking, in a small buried voice she immediately shushed, Is this all I get? Is this the rest of my whole life? Something had come loose in her, just barely, just a hairline crack. She didn't act on it. She just sat there. But the crack was there. She sat very still and folded her hands in her lap. The band played. Her sister danced with her new husband. The string lights swayed. And for one strange, peaceful moment, everything looked completely fine. The bourbon in Dale's glass. The cake untouched under its little plastic bride and groom. Her mother laughing across the room, not knowing a thing. It looked like an ordinary happy wedding on an ordinary summer night. It looked, for about 90 seconds, like nothing bad could possibly happen here. Then the band finished the song, and everything I told you about at the very beginning of this story was about 90 seconds away. It started because Katie came over. That's all. Katie, the bride in her white dress, came bouncing over to pull her big sister up for the group dance, the one where all the women get out on the floor. Maggie glanced at Dale for permission. She actually glanced at him, and Katie saw that glance and something in her went cold. 6 years of watching, and that one glance was the thing that finally broke Katie's patience clean in half. Because a grown woman should not have to ask a man with her eyes if she is allowed to dance at her own sister's wedding. Katie saw it, and she understood it all at once and completely, and she was done being careful. Katie said, "Dale, I'm stealing her for one song, it's my wedding." And she took Maggie by the hand and pulled, laughing on the outside, furious on the inside, and Maggie let herself be pulled. And for 1 second she was out on that floor with her little sister and she was smiling, and Katie squeezed her hand and said low, just for her, "You're okay. I've got you. Just dance." That is when Dale stood up, crossed the floor, and grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back in front of 200 people. And you already know that nobody moved. But I lied a little when I said nobody moved. One person moved. Katie moved. Katie the bride stepped in and shoved Dale in the chest with both hands and screamed, "Get off of her." 6 years of swallowed fury came out of that girl in one shove. And Dale, drunk and enraged and long past caring who was watching, backhanded his sister-in-law across the face on her own wedding day. Katie went down into the folding chairs. The knife she'd been holding from the cake table, the one she'd carried over without thinking, skidded across the floor. Sam, the schoolteacher, the soft-spoken man who'd never thrown a punch in his life, rushed him, and Dale, who was a big man, dropped him with 2 punches and stood over him breathing like a bull. Sam's lip split against his own teeth, and the blood ran down onto his white shirt on his wedding day. And now the room was screaming. Now people were finally on their feet. And Dale spun around, red-faced, and pointed at all of them and roared, "This is between me and my wife. Anybody touches me again, I'll have you all arrested, you understand me? Every one of you." And here is where the whole thing changed from an ugly domestic fight into something worse, because a man in the crowd stepped up to help, and another man stopped him. The second man was wearing a sheriff's department polo shirt. Off duty. His name was Gary Wexler. He was the county sheriff himself, and he was at that wedding because his niece was one of the bridesmaids. And when the first man went to grab Dale, Sheriff Wexler put a hand on that fellow's chest and said, "Calm as Sunday. Easy now. Let's not make this worse. Dale, buddy, why don't you and your wife take it outside and cool off?" "Buddy," He called him Buddy because Dale Prentice golfed with the sheriff. Dale Prentice donated to the sheriff's reelection. Dale had sold the sheriff a truck at cost. And I want you to know this wasn't the first time either. This is the part that makes my blood boil, and I dug into it, so let me tell you. Twice before, neighbors had called the county about screaming and crashing coming from the Prentice house late at night. Twice, deputies had rolled out. And twice, nothing happened because the address came back Prentice, and somebody up the chain made sure it went nowhere. There was a young deputy who'd taken one of those calls, a woman, and she'd stood on that porch and looked at Maggie's face and known, absolutely known, and been told to write it up as no further action. She never forgot it. Hold on to her too. This town had a lot of gears in it, and every one of them was greased to spin the same direction, and that direction was away from the truth. So when the sheriff said Buddy, in that one word, Maggie understood something that turned her blood to ice water. There was no one coming. Not the law, not the crowd, not anybody in that room. The most powerful man at that wedding was on Dale's side, and he had just, in front of everybody, made it Maggie's job to go outside quietly and get hurt where it wouldn't ruin the party. This was not one bad man anymore. This was a whole machine, a whole town, and every gear in it was built to grind her down and protect him. And here is the thing about a moment like that, when you finally see the whole machine at once. It can crush you or it can free you. Because once you understand that the people whose job it is to help you have chosen him, you stop waiting for them. And a person who stops waiting for rescue is a person who becomes very, very dangerous in a quiet way. Maggie didn't know it yet. But the crack from earlier had just become a fault line. Dale grabbed her by the arm and marched her out the side door into the gravel lot, past the trucks and the string lights, out to where his big black SUV sat in the dark at the far end. And nobody followed. The sheriff went back to his beer. The band, God help them, started playing again, because somebody told them to, because the show had to go on, because that's what the machine does, it papers over. Her mother stood frozen and weeping with her hand over her mouth, held back by a cousin who kept saying it wasn't their business. Because when the powerful decide to look away, it is amazing how fast everybody else finds something else to look at. Out in that dark lot, Dale threw Maggie against the side of the SUV. He was shaking with rage. He told her she'd humiliated him for the last time, that when they got home, he was going to teach her a lesson she'd never forget, that her sister was a whore and her family was garbage, and her father was a dead criminal, and she should thank God every day that a man like him had lowered himself to marry her. And he drew his hand back. And Maggie, pinned against that cold metal in the dark, did the only thing left to do. And I want you to understand it wasn't a plan. She didn't strategize. It came up out of somewhere older than thought, out of a 9-year-old on a porch step with a skinned knee hearing her daddy say, "If you can't stay away from him, you call me." Her hand moved on its own. She reached into the little purse still slung across her body, and her fingers found her phone, and they found in her contacts a number she had not called in 6 years but had never once had the heart to delete. Through 6 years of deleting Carol, deleting friends, deleting her whole life to keep the peace, she had never been able to delete this one number. Some part of her had kept it like a coal buried in ash, still warm just in case. A number saved under one word. Bear. She didn't even lift the phone to her ear. She just pressed it in the dark against her own hip, and she heard it connect, and she said the only thing that mattered, loud enough for the phone to catch it and quiet enough that Dale, ranting, didn't notice. "Can you come get me? I'm at Katie's wedding. County Road 9. Dale's going to hurt me. Please." And 40 miles away, in the back room of a bar called the Ironside, an old man's phone lit up on the pool table, and the name on the screen was a name he had not seen in 6 years, a name that stopped his heart for one full second. Maggie. Duke's girl. And the big man picked it up, and he heard the wind, and he heard a man's voice screaming filth, and he heard, underneath it all, a woman he had held 1 hour after she was born saying please. Bear stood up so fast the pool table rocked. And if you're still with me, and you want to see what 40 miles of open highway does to a man who made a promise to a dying friend, do me one favor right now and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. Bear did not say a word into the phone. He didn't need to. He just held it to his ear and listened for 3 more seconds to make sure of the address, and then he lowered it, and he looked around that back room at the Ironside where 6 of his brothers were sitting, and every one of them saw his face and stood up at the same time without being told. Because that is what a face like that means. Bear said 2 things. He said Duke's daughter. And he said County Road 9. That haul out past the feed store. Now, that was it. That was the whole meeting. But here's what you didn't see. As those 7 men walked out into the Ironside's lot, Bear was already on his phone again, thumb moving, and he made 3 calls in the time it took to throw a leg over his bike. 1 to the clubhouse. 1 to a man named Tommy, who was having dinner with his family and left his plate on the table. 1 to a chapter 2 towns over. By the time Bear's engine turned over, a phone tree 6 years in the building was lighting up across 3 counties, and men were standing up from dinner tables and garage stools and living room couches all over that dark countryside, and every one of them was pointing his headlight at County Road 9. Bear didn't ride out with 6 men. Bear rode out with 6 men, and a wave behind him that hadn't caught up yet. Here is a thing people who don't understand this life get wrong. They think it's about the leather and the noise and the tough talk. It isn't. It's about one thing. It's about the fact that when one of yours calls and says please, the answer is already yes before they finish the word. Duke had built that charter on it. Bear had kept it that way for 6 years since. And Maggie Sullivan, whether she'd warned the world or not, whether she'd invited them to her wedding or not, was on the inside of that promise for life. Her daddy had made sure of it. You are one of us. You will always be one of us. Bear had been standing at the foot of that hospital bed when Duke said it, and he'd carried the guilt of those 6 silent years like a stone in his chest, and now that stone had turned into 40 miles of throttle. Back in the parking lot, Dale still had his hand up. But something had made him hesitate. Maybe it was that she hadn't flinched. For the first time in 6 years, Maggie Sullivan was standing against that truck and she was not flinching. She was looking at him with a strange calm, and it unsettled him, because a scared thing that stops being scared is a thing you no longer understand. A bully runs on fear the way an engine runs on gas, and hers had just cut out, and he could feel it, and it frightened him and he didn't know why. He said, "What are you smiling at?" She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't crying either. She said, quiet, "You should have let me talk to that old man." Dale said, "What?" She said it again. "The old man at the bar. You should have let me talk to him. He rode with my father." And Dale laughed, an ugly bark of a laugh, and said, "Your father? Your father was a broke-down old biker who died in a county hospital. You're nothing, Maggie. You came from nothing." And Maggie looked up at him, and for the first time in 6 years she looked at him without a single ounce of fear, and she said the truest thing she'd said in all that time. She said, "You have no idea where I came from." That's when the old man in the cheap sport coat came around the corner of the building. Remember him? The one Dale had waved off at the bar. He hadn't left. He'd been standing in the shadow by the propane tanks the whole time, an old man nobody paid any attention to, watching everything, and he had already made his own phone call 2 minutes before Maggie made hers. That was the call he made when he saw Dale's hand on her neck. His name was Pete. They called him Preacher on account of he never cursed, and he had ridden 30 years with Duke Sullivan, and he had recognized Duke's face in that girl the second she smiled at him. Preacher was 71 years old, and he weighed maybe $150 soaking wet, and he walked out into that lot slow, hands loose at his sides, with no more fear in him than a fence post, because when you've buried as many friends as Preacher had, one drunk car salesman doesn't move the needle. He said, "Son, you're gonna want to take your hand off Duke's daughter." Dale spun around. "Who the hell are you?" Preacher just looked at him with those flat old eyes and said, "I'm nobody. I'm just the fella who called some folks. And they're coming." Dale did not understand. How could he? He shoved Maggie back against the truck and pointed at the old man and said, "You called who?" "The cops. Sheriff Wexler's inside old-timer. He's a friend of mine, so you go right ahead." And Preacher smiled, and it was not a nice smile, and he said, "Oh, I didn't call the law." And he tilted his head, like a man listening for a train. "Son, I want you to do something for me. I want you to be real quiet for just a second." And Dale, confused, actually did. And in that quiet, in the far, far distance, way out on the dark highway past the feed store, so faint you could feel it in your chest before you could hear it in your ears, there came a sound. A low, rolling thunder that was not thunder. It got louder. It doubled. It tripled. It became a wall of engines. And Preacher closed his eyes for a second, like a man hearing an old song, and he said, soft, "There they are." Maggie heard it, and her legs almost went out from under her, because she knew that sound. She had grown up inside that sound. It was the sound of Sunday mornings, and her father's laugh and men who cried at piano recitals. It was the sound of a driveway 3 deep with motorcycles. It was the sound of 40 men who would appear out of nowhere. It was the sound of the air she used to breathe. It was the sound of coming home. Headlights swung off the highway and poured into the gravel lot, one after another, a river of them, and the noise was enormous now, engines and gravel and the whole night shaking. And it did not stop. It kept coming, 20 bikes, 30, more headlights still turning off the highway in a chain that ran back into the dark as far as you could see. And people started spilling out of the reception hall to see what was happening, the whole wedding pouring out into the lot. the band stopping mid-song. And there in the middle of it all stood Dale Prentice, finally starting, just starting, to understand that something was very wrong, and that whatever it was bigger than him, and that for the first time in his adult life he had walked into a room where his name meant nothing. The bikes fanned out in a wide arc, boxing in the black SUV, boxing in Dale, cutting off the dark end of the lot, and one by one the engines cut off. And in the sudden ringing silence, boots hit gravel. Dozens of them. And nobody said a word, and somehow the quiet was louder than all the engines had been. And out of the center of it walked a mountain. Gray in his beard now, slower than he used to be, a little heavier in the step, but still a mountain, still 6 foot something of a man in a leather vest with a patch on the front that Dale couldn't read in the dark and wouldn't have understood if he could. Bear walked straight across that lot, past his brothers, past the staring wedding guests, past the sheriff who had come out onto the steps and gone very, very pale, and he did not slow down, and he did not so much as glance at Dale, and somehow that was the most frightening thing of all, that Bear walked right past the man who done it like the man wasn't even there. He walked right up to Maggie. And this enormous man in front of everyone dropped down to one knee in the gravel so he was looking up at her instead of down, and he took her hand, the one Dale had twisted, and he held it like it was made of glass, turning it gentle in his huge scarred fingers to see if it was hurt, and he said, in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "There's my girl. I'm here. I got you. I'm so sorry it took me 6 years." And Maggie Sullivan, who had not cried in front of another human being in longer than she could remember, who had trained herself to go still and silent and small, who had learned to feel nothing so that nothing could be used against her, put her free hand over her mouth and made a sound like something breaking loose, a sound 6 years in the coming, and she said, "I didn't know if you'd come." And Bear stood up, still holding her hand, and he looked at her and said, "Baby girl, I would ride through hell with a gas can. Your daddy asked me to look after you and I have failed at it for 6 years, and that ends tonight." And she fell against his chest, this enormous man, and he wrapped one arm around her the way you'd shelter a candle from the wind. And over the top of her head then, and only then, Bear turned his head and looked at Dale Prentice for the first time. You want to know what real power looks like? It is not loud. Dale had spent his whole life being loud, throwing his weight, dropping names, and it had always worked, because he'd only ever done it to people who had less than him. That's the only trick a man like Dale ever has, and it only works one direction. Bear didn't raise his voice 1 inch. He looked at Dale the way you look at something you found on the bottom of your boot, mild, almost bored, and he said, "You put your hands on this woman." It wasn't a question. Dale, who was a coward, and every bully is a coward, this is the oldest, truest thing in the world. Dale looked around at that ring of silent men, 40 of them, 50, boots in the gravel and firelight from the string lights sliding off their faces, and he did the coward's math, the math he'd done his whole life, the math that had always come out in his favor, and for the first time the numbers didn't work. So he reached for the only card he had left. He pointed at the steps. He said, "Sheriff. Sheriff Wexler. These are criminals. These are the angels. Arrest them. They're threatening me. Do your job." Everybody looked at Sheriff Gary Wexler. And Sheriff Wexler stood on those steps with 200 wedding guests and 40-some Hell's Angels and his own niece all looking at him. And he did the math too. He knew who Bear was. Everybody in 3 counties in law enforcement knew who Bear was, and knew that this was Duke Sullivan's people, and knew there was a whole quiet history there that a smart man did not want to be on the wrong side of. But it was more than fear, and I'll give the man this much. Wexler stood on those steps and he looked out at that lot, and he saw Katie the bride holding a napkin full of ice to a swelling cheek. He saw Sam the schoolteacher with blood down his white shirt. He saw Maggie's face in the string lights, really saw it, maybe for the first time, and maybe some part of him thought about those 2 calls his deputies had rolled out on and buried, and maybe some part of him got tired, right there, of being a gear in that particular machine. He understood, standing on those steps, that he had a choice to make in front of his entire community, and that whatever he chose, he was going to have to live in this county afterward and look these people in the eye at the grocery store for the rest of his life. And to his credit, or maybe just his sense of self-preservation, or maybe a little of both, Gary Wexler cleared his throat and said, "Dale, I saw you hit your sister-in-law. I saw you drag your wife out here. I saw the whole thing. Ain't nobody threatening you. You need to settle down, and thank God these folks are more patient than you deserve." Dale's face went white. His last card folded. His buddy gone. The machine that had protected him for 6 years just switched off, right there in front of the whole town, because the machine only ever ran on the idea that Dale was the most powerful man in the room, that Dale was the safe bet, that Dale was the one you sided with. And Dale was not the most powerful man in the room anymore. Not even close. And everybody could see it at once, and a thing like that, once everybody sees it, can never be unseen. Now here is the thing about this moment, and I want to be honest with you, because a lesser story would have Bear beat that man to death in the gravel and roll off into the night. That is not what happened, and it is better than that. Bear let go of Maggie's hand, gentle, and he handed her back to her sister and her mother, who had pushed to the front now, and he walked over to Dale Prentice slow, and Dale backed up until he hit his own truck and had nowhere to go, and Bear stopped about a foot away and looked down at him. And every single person in that lot held their breath. You could have heard a leaf drop. And Bear said, "You want to hit somebody." "Hit me." Dale didn't move. Bear said, "Come on. Big man. I watched you crack a bride across the face and drop a schoolteacher who never threw a punch in his life. Real tough. I'm right here. I'm 62 years old, and I got one bad knee. Take your best shot." Dale pressed himself back against the truck and shook his head, and his mouth worked but nothing came out, and then a wet stain spread down the front of his expensive pants, dark against the tan fabric, and 200 people saw it. That is the justice, right there if you want to know. Not a broken bone. Not blood in the gravel. Bear made Dale Prentice show everyone what he actually was, underneath the suit and the billboard and the dealership and the swagger. All that money, all that grinning off the highway, all those years of being the biggest man in 3 counties, and when he finally, for the first time in his life, stood in front of somebody who wasn't afraid of him and never would be, he wet himself against the side of his own SUV like a child. The whole town saw the truth of him in 1 second. And I promise you, no amount of money and no dealership commercial and no move to another state was ever going to wash that off, because everybody there was going to tell that story for the rest of their lives, and every time they told it, Dale Prentice was going to be exactly what he really was. But Bear wasn't quite done, and neither am I. He leaned in close, so only Dale could hear the first part, and he said low, almost kind, which was the terrifying part, "You married Duke Sullivan's daughter. You know what that makes you to me. It makes you family. And I take care of family." Then he straightened up and said the rest loud, for everybody, and this is the part Dale would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Bear said, "So here is how it's going to be. My girl is getting in a truck with her mother and her sister tonight, and she is never going to sleep under your roof again. Tomorrow, a lawyer named Ruth Kepler is going to call you, and you are going to give Maggie the house, the accounts, and one of those cars off your lot, and you are going to sign whatever she puts in front of you, and you are going to do it fast and quiet. Because if you fight her, if you make one phone call to one lawyer of your own, if her name so much as leaves your mouth wrong, I have got 40 brothers and 30 years of patience, and we will be regulars at that dealership. Every single day. Standing out front by the flags, real friendly, talking to every customer that pulls in. Just talking. Telling them about you. You understand what I'm telling you?" Dale, shaking, nodded. Bear said, "Say it out loud so these folks hear you agree." And Dale Prentice, king of 3 counties, whose face was on billboards you could see from the highway, whispered, "I understand." Bear said louder. And Dale said it again, cracking, breaking, "I understand." And somewhere in the crowd, somebody laughed. Just one person, one short disbelieving bark of a laugh at the sheer size of what had just fallen. And then it caught, the way fire catches, and it spread, and the whole night that this man had ruled for 6 years turned around and laughed at him. 200 people, the whole town, laughing, and that sound followed him as he crawled into his SUV and fumbled the keys and ground the engine and finally lurched out of that gravel lot and drove off into the dark alone. And nobody, not one single soul in that whole crowd, tried to stop him. They just watched his taillights shrink down County Road 9 and disappear, and then they turned back around to the wedding. Then it was quiet again, just the ticking of dozens of cooling engines and the string lights buzzing, and Bear turned back around to the only person who mattered. He found Maggie in the crowd, wrapped up now in her sister's arms, in her mother's arms, Sam the schoolteacher standing over all of them with an ice pack on his lip and tears running down his face, and Bear walked over and the family opened up to let him in, the way you let in someone who was always supposed to be there. And Preacher, the old man in the cheap sport coat, came and stood at the edge of it, and Maggie reached out one hand and pulled him in two, because he was the one who'd been watching, the one who called, the one who'd known her daddy's face in hers, and he held her hand in both of his and he said, "You look just like him. You always did." And she cried, and it was a different kind of crying than she'd done in 6 years. And if you don't know the difference between the two kinds of crying, I hope you never learn it, and I hope one day you get to feel the good kind the way she felt it that night. Now let me tell you how it ended, because the aftermath is where the real story lives, and it lived a long time. Dale Prentice signed everything. Ruth Kepler, the lawyer, a small, ferocious woman who'd taken more than one call from Bear's charter over the years and never once asked a question she didn't want the answer to, said in 30 years she'd never seen a wealthy man agree to terms that fast. He signed over the house. He signed over the accounts he'd controlled every penny of for 6 years, the accounts he'd made Maggie beg for grocery money out of, the accounts he'd made her cry over a $12 book. He gave her a car off the lot, and she picked on purpose the least flashy one there, a plain gray sedan, no chrome, no billboard shine, because she'd had enough of shiny things that were really cages. And then, and this is the part that tells you everything, Dale Prentice quietly listed the dealership, and within a year he'd sold Prentice Auto and moved out of state, because it turned out a man simply cannot run a business in a town where every single person who walks onto the lot watched him wet his pants and whisper, "I understand," twice. Sales dried up. Fewer people waved back at the billboards. His salesmen started quitting. The whole thing that Dale was, the whole edifice, it ran on people being a little afraid of him and a lot impressed by him, and both of those had died in one gravel lot on a summer night. The billboards came down, one by one, blank white rectangles along the highway where his grin used to be. Somebody said he moved to Arizona. Nobody checked. Nobody cared. And here's the thing I love, here's the poetry of it. Bear never had to send even one man to stand in front of that dealership. He never had to. The threat was never the point. The town did it for him, just by knowing the truth. The truth was the only weapon that ever got used, and the truth was enough. Sheriff Gary Wexler did not get reelected. Turns out folks have long memories about the night the sheriff called an abuser buddy, in front of the whole county, even if he did come around by the end of it. And you remember that young deputy, the woman who'd stood on Maggie's porch twice and been told to write it up as nothing and never forgot it. Her name was Alicia Reyes, and she ran against Wexler the next cycle, and she ran on exactly one thing, that this county was going to start believing women the first time, not the 40th. She won in a landslide. And the first thing Sheriff Reyes did, the very first thing, was pull every domestic call from the last 10 years that had been buried, and build a real program out of the wreckage, victim advocates, and a safe line and deputies trained to see what she'd been trained to ignore. And every Christmas from then on, that program got an envelope, no name on the outside, a check inside big enough to matter, signed only, from Duke's people. Sheriff Reyes knew exactly who it was. She never said a word about it. She just cashed it and did the work. That still happens. That is happening right now. This year, this month. An envelope every December, quiet, no cameras, from a man who made a promise at the foot of a hospital bed and decided it applied to more than one girl. Katie's marriage survived the worst wedding day in county history. More than survived it. There's a thing that happens sometimes, where the worst day becomes the day everybody points back to and says that's when we knew what we were made of. Sam, the schoolteacher, the soft-spoken man who took 2 punches trying to defend a woman he'd only just become family with, who bled down his own white wedding shirt and got right back up, earned something that night that money cannot buy. Bear found him at the edge of the crowd holding that ice pack to his lip, and this mountain of a man walked over and looked down at this skinny history teacher and put out his hand. And when Sam took it, Bear held on and said, "You wanted a man twice your size for her." Twice. You got more sand in you than most men I've ridden with, and I mean that. And from then on, Sam was welcome at the Ironside any night he wanted, and I'm telling you to this day, every so often you'll see that skinny history teacher shooting a terrible, hopeless game of pool with a bunch of old outlaws who genuinely think he hung the moon, and losing and laughing and belonging. Katie comes too. Their kids know Bear as Uncle Bear and think nothing of it, and that is maybe the most beautiful part, that the next generation just grows up thinking a room full of leather and thunder is a safe and gentle place, because for them it always was. And Maggie, sweet Maggie, who learned to go still. It did not fix her overnight. I want to be honest about that, because these things don't, and I'd be lying to you and dishonoring her if I pretended it did. She flinched at loud noises for a long time. She'd hear a man raise his voice in a parking lot, any man about anything, and her whole body would go small and quiet before her mind caught up and told her she was safe now. She had to learn how to spend her own money without a knot in her stomach, how to buy a book and throw the receipt away like a free person, how to laugh loud in public without checking the room first, how to answer a ringing phone without her insides dropping. 6 years of training does not wash off in a night. She went to a counselor twice a week for 2 years. Hard work, ugly work, the kind of work nobody claps for. And Bear drove her to that first appointment himself on the back of his bike, because she'd made the appointment 3 times and canceled it 3 times, too scared to walk through the door, and Bear showed up at her house that 4th time and said, "I'll take you. And I'll sit in that waiting room reading old fishing magazines all day if that's what it takes, and I won't say a word, and I'll be right there when you come out." And he did. That giant, terrifying man sat in a tiny pastel waiting room reading a 3-year-old magazine about bass fishing, for an hour every appointment, for the first several months, until she could do it on her own. And she'll tell you that's the thing that got her through the door. Not the rescue in the parking lot. The waiting room. The showing up and showing up and showing up. Because that was what her daddy had said the old man did. He showed up. That was who they were. Slowly she came back. And I mean the real her, the one from before, the one who existed before a man with flowers and a billboard decided to spend 6 years convincing her she was nothing. She started riding again, out in the empty fields first, the same fields where Bear had taught her at 15, stalling the bike, laughing again. You got it again. And then, when she was ready, out on the open road with the wind taking 6 years right off her shoulders. She'd show up at the Ironside on Sunday afternoons, and the whole place would light up. Dozens of rough old men going soft all at once. Because to them, she wasn't just Maggie. She was a piece of Duke walking around. She was living proof the old man wasn't all the way gone. She hung his photo behind the bar, that big laughing man, and under it she hung his old cut, and the place felt more like itself with him back up on the wall. She stopped covering the past. She stopped being ashamed of where she came from, the shame Dale had spent 6 years feeding her. She started telling people, out loud, chin up, no flinch, "My dad was the president of this charter." And you could see, when she said it, exactly whose daughter she was. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go, and this is the thing I really wanted to tell you, the reason this story is worth an hour of your evening. About a year after the wedding, Maggie was at the Ironside on a Sunday afternoon, coffee in front of her, her father's photo over her shoulder, and the door opened, and a young woman came in, maybe 25, with sunglasses on indoors and long sleeves in the summer, and Maggie knew. She knew instantly, the way you always know because it takes one to know one. The concealer along the cheekbone. The way she held her own body, small and careful, like she was trying to take up less space in the world. The sunglasses at 4 in the afternoon. Maggie had worn every one of those things. The young woman had heard the story, because by then everybody in 3 counties had heard the story. It had become the kind of thing people told at kitchen tables, And somewhere in a bad house on a bad night, this young woman had heard somebody say, "If you're ever in real trouble, there's a place out past the feed store. Ask for the people who took care of the Prentice girl." And she'd held onto that the way Maggie once held onto a number saved under one word. And on the worst night of her life, she'd driven 2 hours in the dark to find it. And now she stood in the doorway shaking, and she said to the room, "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm here. Somebody told me, somebody said if I came here." And she couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come, because saying the words out loud is the hardest thing there is. It's the whole mountain, and Maggie of all people knew it. And Maggie Sullivan set down her coffee, and she crossed that room, slow, no sudden moves, the way you approach something that's been hurt. And she reached out and took that young woman's hand, gentle, the same hand a man had twisted in the dark a year before, the same hand Bear had held like glass and turned to check for breaks, the same hand old preacher had held in both of his and said, "You look just like him." And she didn't twist it, and she didn't grab it, and she didn't pull. She just held it and let the young woman feel that it was safe, that nothing was going to happen, that she could stop bracing. And she said the words that had been said to her, the words that were passed down, hand to hand, from a dying man to a big soft mountain to a girl in a parking lot, and now to a stranger in a doorway. She said, "You're safe now. You're one of us. We got you." And behind the bar, under the photo of a big laughing man who'd been gone for years but somehow was right there in the room, dozens of men stood up at the same time, without being told, without a word, boots on the floor, the way they'd stood up in a back room a year before when they saw Bear's face, the way 40 men had stood up out of Sunday dinners across 3 counties, the way they would always stand up. Not to frighten her, to promise her, so that this shaking young woman in the doorway could see with her own eyes what it looks like when a whole world decides you will never be hurt like that again. Because that's the thing about a promise like that. It doesn't die with the man who made it. It doesn't even stay with the girl he made it about. It just keeps finding the next person who needs to hear it, and the next, passed hand to hand down through the years, please always answered with yes before the word is finished. And if you had told Dale Prentice, that first day at the dental office, standing there with his flowers and his billboard grin, that the quiet girl he decided to own came from a world like that, a world where the strong stand between the taking and the folks who can't stop it, he'd have laughed in your face. He came from nothing, he'd have said. She was nothing. He never did understand where she came from. He never understood any of it, not the promise, not the world, not the woman, not even, right up until the end himself.